Welcome to Binge on Self-Love podcast. I'm your host Anna, but you can call me Anchi. For the past few years, I've been struggling with binge eating disorder, severe procrastination issues, and a really poor self-image. Any kind of self-love has been pretty much non-existent. But I've realized I'm not alone in this, as millions of others struggle with accepting who they are, and we all fight our inner battles. I'm not an expert on this, nor I claim to be, but I have a story and I want to share it with you guys, raw and honest, with all its highs and lows. Every Tuesday, I share my experience, thoughts, and tips on overcoming binge eating disorder, procrastination, and tips on gaining self-love and respect. Join me and our listeners on our journey to build a healthier and kinder relationship with ourselves. Make sure to subscribe to Binge on Self-Love podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any future episode. For more content on binge eating, procrastination, self-love, and self-acceptance, visit bingeonselflove.com and follow me on Instagram at bingeonselflove. Disclaimer: Binge on Self-Love podcast is intended for informational purposes only. It doesn't provide professional medical advice, and it is not a substitute for a diagnosis or treatment. Hello everyone, welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. My name is Anna, but you can call me Anchi, and I'm your host. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being here with me today. First things first, I need to apologize, and I want to apologize for taking unannounced 2-week break. Partially it was unintentional and partially it was intentional. There were actually 2 reasons why I took a break. Number one, it was because we moved to a different city, so I was pretty busy with packing, with getting stuff done, managing things and moving and stuff like that. And the reason number 2 why I took a break was my procrastinating self. Therefore, I say it was unintentional, but also intentional. I knew I was going to move. I knew that many weeks before the actual moving process, or actually many months before the moving process, and I kept telling myself, girl, you need to prepare episodes in advance because chances are you won't have time to record them once things get busy, and that's precisely what happened. And because I don't want to put out not necessarily shitty episode, but an episode that was done with haste, I took some time off to be able to prepare episodes that I know and hope will be helpful and beneficial for both you and me as well. So I wanted to apologize for the 2-week break. I wanted to make it clear from the get-go that I screw this up, so I apologize and I take full responsibility for that. Now, what crossed my mind during the 2-week break was, why am I even doing this podcast? And I don't mean that in like a negative way, like doubting why am I doing this. I just really started to think about what was the thought, what was the initial reason why I started doing this podcast, what motivates me to continue to do so. And I thought it could be an interesting idea to turn this into an episode and share with you why I started this podcast, what my goal is, also if it helps me in any way, where I stand with my recovery, and also what I hope the future of this podcast will be. So heads up, this episode is going to be a more chatty one and less focused on one particular problem, but I think just catching up, letting you know more about who is behind this podcast and what things I deal with can be cool. So without further ado and without further chit-chatting, let's get into the episode. Enchanté. I started this podcast in September 2020 after months and months of thinking about it and dreaming about it. I also do have a blog that I started probably like 2 years ago, but quite honestly, I rarely posted anything there because no one was reading it and I had no motivation to keep that blog. So I started the bingeonselflove.com blog in order to share my experience with binge eating disorder, with low self-esteem, with procrastination, with self-loathe, and basically all these different things that I was personally dealing with. And after some time, I started to play with the idea to turn this into a podcast because I love listening to podcasts. I love them way more than YouTube videos because you don't have to sit and watch a video. I personally focus much more on the content when I just listen and I am not distracted by the visuals. And I also love that I can do something else while listening to a podcast. I often go for a run, or I cook, or I do some house chores, whatever it might be. And the more podcasts I listen to, the more I felt like I would love to have one on my own, where I could share my thoughts, my experience, and where I could have meaningful conversations with people, which I hope to bring to you guys soon. I also see this podcast as a chance how to practice and improve my English skills because I am from the Czech Republic, if you didn't know. So English is not my native language, but I find this a really helpful way how to practice it and how to be a little more comfortable when speaking. And additionally, it's an excellent way for me how to become a little less shy and a little less terrified. So that's how I started this podcast, and what I was terrified of at the beginning and what made me question whether or not should I be doing this podcast, whether I am eligible to do this, is the fact that I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or nutritional therapist. I do not have any background, any education of this sort. So obviously I am not allowed to advise anyone, neither would I want to, neither I think it would be possible. A lot of podcasts that focus on food and relationship with food, eating disorders, dieting, and all these kinds of topics are hosted usually by professionals. So that's what made me question whether this podcast is something I should do and whether I am really eligible to do so. But the truth is that many of those people who do have a podcast also have some sort of coaching service or counseling or business, which is obviously great. But at the same time, that's not something I would want to do or even could do. So I thought why not to share my experience? Why not to try to connect with people who may be going through the similar stuff and share my story, hopefully in the future share your stories as well, and create this environment and community where we can all feel understood, I guess. Because I've realized that very often just hearing or seeing or talking to someone who has gone through something similar, who has been in a similar situation like you, whether that's an eating disorder or recovery or self-esteem issues, procrastination issues, whatever it might be, that it can be very, very helpful. And you don't always necessarily need an advice from someone. You just really need to feel heard and listened to and understood. I know that when my binge eating disorder was at its worst, I was desperate to find someone who I could relate to, who I knew was going through the same, who I know would know exactly the feelings, the process, and everything behind what I was feeling and dealing with. And it could have been someone sharing their story on YouTube, it could be an article, a blog post, an Instagram post, or even someone I met in person. That person doesn't solve the problem for you, obviously, but it gives you a sense of understanding, sense of compassion, and someone to be able to relate to. And that's exactly what I want you to find in this podcast and what I hope you to find in this podcast. I share my story, my experience, and hopefully in the future I will be able to share the experience of other people as well. I share the obstacles I've dealt with. I share some tips and tricks that I personally found helpful, and I know it's not going to solve the problem for you, but what I hope for is that this podcast will make you feel more understood. Maybe it will give you the courage to either start or continue your recovery journey. Maybe it will help you understand what you or someone close to you may be going through, and hopefully it will give you a sense of not being alone in this. So that's what my initial goal was, that's what my purpose is, and what it always will be with this podcast. I would love to hear what you think, whether or not you find this podcast helpful. Some of you reached out to me on Instagram at Binge on Self-Love, and you sent me such lovely messages, and I'm incredibly grateful for your feedback and for that, because it helps me to really believe that this podcast has a meaning and it is really helpful to someone. And I'm always happy to hear what you think, whether or not you find this podcast helpful, whether you have some specific topics you would like me to talk about. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me either on Instagram at bingeonselflove, or you can send me an email at anci@bingeonselflove.com. As you may know, if you've listened to any of the previous episodes, I myself struggled with binge eating disorder for many years. I think 6 or 7 years. It's really hard to say precisely when it started, but I think I was 18 or 19 when I remember I binged for the first time. And the binge eating disorder developed to such a stage that all I could think about all day, and what I did all day, every day for literally years, was binging. And I can confidently say that binge eating stole, or I let binge eating stole, some of the best years of my life from me. I'm 27 now, and all the time between 19 to 24, 25 was the time when my mind was consumed by the binge eating disorder. And I felt really desperate. I wanted to stop binge eating, but at the same time I didn't, because it was the only thing I knew for a really long time. And I didn't understand why was this happening. And at first I had no idea what is even happening. Why am I eating so much? And why do I do all these secret shopping sprees and secret binge sessions? And why do I feel so guilty? And why I can't seem to think about anything else? And like I mentioned earlier, I was desperate to feel any kind of understanding and any kind of sympathy. And I was desperate to talk to anyone who I could relate to at least a little bit. I later found help in my therapist, but it took me years to get there. And I also think that binge eating and binge eating disorder especially are accompanied by such a huge amount of shame and guilt that no one really likes to talk about it. Until this day, many of my friends and relatives who do not listen to this podcast or who do not know about this podcast don't know about the issue I've had, because it's like hard both to explain it to someone who never experienced it, and it is also hard for people to understand it if they never experienced it. I don't want to generalize or compare, but I personally think that for people it's easier, not easy, but easier to understand if someone is struggling with anorexia or maybe with bulimia. But I feel like with binge eating disorder, it is still such a mystery to so many people that they tend to perceive it as just as a lack of self-control, or they tend to perceive people who struggle with binge eating disorder as people who like to eat just way too much. So that's another reason why I wanted to speak about it, as terrifying and ashamed I felt when sharing this for the first time. I think it is essential to talk about it and to help people understand what this issue is and that it is an eating disorder. I've been in recovery for binge eating disorder for, I think, 3 years now. I don't really binge anymore, but sometimes, especially during times that are either mentally or emotionally demanding, I find myself inclined towards food and to eat way beyond the satiety point and way beyond feeling comfortable. Recovery looks different for everyone, and also the reason why you develop it, or you develop an eating disorder, will be different for everyone. There have been many different reasons why I think I developed it. And like I said, I am in recovery. I've been in recovery for some time now, and I would say like it's so much better than it was before. But again, I am currently going through a lot of changes. I moved to a different city. I will start a new job soon. I'm in a very new environment, and although it is all exciting, at the same time it can feel pretty overwhelming, and My always go-to way how to deal with emotions and with situations was binging. So I'm not gonna lie, I will say that some of these moments are challenging. So sometimes I do catch myself like thinking about binging, but I think it's just part of the process. Sometimes you feel stronger, more comfortable. Sometimes you do know what you want, and sometimes you are not so sure, and sometimes you feel the urges more than before. Sometimes you think, is this recovery really worth it? Sometimes you doubt. I think that's normal and that's part of the process. So I wanted to share this with you, show you that even though I have made tremendous progress, sometimes it still gets hard. And sometimes I do catch myself reaching for food to avoid some feeling, some emotion, or certain situation. And as I said, I think it is all normal and it is all part of the process. So that's all I have for you guys today and all that I wanted to share today. I wanted to give you some sort of an update on where I'm at, where this podcast is at, and I wanted to encourage you to let me know what topics you would like me to cover, what guests you would like to hear in the future on this podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the Binge on Self-Love podcast on any platform where you get your podcasts at. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay true to yourself and talk to you soon. Bye. Thank you so much for spending your time listening to Binge on Self-Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to Binge on Self-Love podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any future episode. You can find more content on binge eating, procrastination, and self-acceptance at bingeonselflove.com and on Instagram at bingeonselflove. Talk to you soon. Bye!